a young businessman from Columbus, bought the long-abandoned Hole farmstead just outside Marietta, Ohio, not expecting much beyond some repairs. But when the real estate agent casually mentioned that part of the basement had been sealed off since the 1930s, he grew curious. The wall of mismatched bricks in the old stone foundation looked suspicious, but no one had ever bothered to open it. When he finally knocked through those 91-year-old bricks, what he uncovered forced historians to rethink a hidden and disturbing part of Ohio's past, a chapter that powerful families had spent nearly a century trying to bury. Behind that wall lay the truth about Dr. Amos Fletcher and his underground hospital during the cholera epidemic of 1832, a truth more horrifying than anyone could have guessed. The discovery started innocently enough with plans to expand a root cellar. But it soon became clear that this basement was tied to a summer of terror almost 2 centuries earlier. In 1832, cholera, known as the Blue Death, crept up the Ohio River from New Orleans, devastating cities along the way. By July, it reached Marietta, then a small town of fewer than 2,000 people. Panic spread quickly. Into this fear stepped Dr. Amos Fletcher, a tall, severe man with sharp gray eyes and prematurely white hair, carrying the credentials of the University of Pennsylvania and letters from Philadelphia's finest physicians. In a frontier town where most doctors were little more than quacks with razors and miracle tonics, Fletcher stood out as the real thing. Meanwhile, just northeast of town, the Hole family farm offered Fletcher exactly what he needed. The Holes had settled their 100 acres back in 1798, when Ohio was still wilderness. By 1832, the farm had passed to Marcus Hole, a quiet man raising wheat cattle and 3 small children with his wife Sarah. Marcus knew little of medicine, but what he had was space. His stone basement was cool, large, and isolated with rooms that could be scrubbed clean, perfect for housing patients, away from a town gripped by fear. That basement, however, would become far more than a refuge. It was the beginning of a nightmare Marietta would try to forget, and that Marcus Hole's descendants would seal behind bricks for nearly a century. By late July, Fletcher approached Marcus with a proposal that seemed almost too good to refuse. He wanted to turn the basement into a private hospital for cholera patients whose families could afford special care, offering Marcus $50 a month more money than the farm made in an entire season. The arrangement looked simple enough. Marcus would provide the space, Fletcher would handle the medicine, and the family's financial worries might finally ease. The basement was cool, separate from the main house, and seemed ideal for isolating the sick. Sarah Holloway hesitated, uneasy about hosting diseased strangers beneath their children's feet. But Marcus reminded her of the debts hanging over them and the chance at security. By early August, Fletcher had hauled in his instruments, oil lamps, and tables, converting the once quiet storage rooms into quarters for the afflicted. Beds, basins, and chamber pots lined the walls. The largest chamber became Fletcher's operating room, where he laid out his polished tools with a sense of grim purpose. To neighbors, it looked like a proper medical facility, crude but respectable. What the Holloways didn't know was that Fletcher had been quietly forced out of Pennsylvania Hospital just 6 months earlier for his reckless experiments, his career in Philadelphia ending in whispers and sealed letters. The first patient arrived on August 15, 1832. Jacob Wittman, a wealthy grain merchant, entrusted his only daughter Elizabeth to Fletcher's care. The girl, just 22, was already racked with violent cramps, relentless diarrhea, and the bluish skin that earned cholera its nickname, the Blue Death. Wittman, desperate to save her, paid Fletcher $25 up front, believing he was buying his daughter the finest treatment west of Philadelphia. Fletcher promised results, citing European medical methods unknown in Marietta's crude public wards, and demanded strict quarantine. Whitman left with the assurance he could visit in 3 days. Elizabeth Whitman never lived to see the morning. Fletcher's methods, hidden from the grieving families, were extreme even by the standards of the day. He believed cholera stemmed from corrupted humors in the blood and that only the harshest purging could save a patient. His so-called graduated depletion therapy meant draining staggering amounts of blood, sometimes quarts at a time, while dosing victims with calomel, a mercury compound that triggered violent purging. Regular doctors bled patients by the ounce. Fletcher bled them by the pint. Others prescribed mercury in tiny doses. Fletcher gave enough to poison a healthy man. He documented everything in a meticulous leather-bound journal, his entries neat and clinical. Patient exhibits typical cholera symptoms upon admission. Commenced depletion at 2 p.m. with initial bleeding of 24 ounces. Pulse weakened, but complexion improved. Administered 15 grains calomel with laudanum. Second bleeding of 20 ounces at 6 p.m. produced marked improvement in humoral balance. Patient resting comfortably. Third bleeding scheduled for midnight. To Fletcher, this was progress. In reality, Elizabeth's body was being stripped of its strength, drained of blood, and poisoned by mercury until she no longer had the power to fight. She didn't die of cholera. She died of Fletcher's cure. Elizabeth Whitman's body was laid to rest not by grieving kin, but by Fletcher's own hands. He ordered a hurried burial in a shallow grave behind the farmhouse, assuring Marcus Holloway that speed was vital to prevent contagion. When Jacob Whitman returned days later, eager to see his daughter Fletcher, delivered the news with solemn professionalism. He claimed Elizabeth had passed quietly in her sleep. After showing brief signs of improvement, her disease moving too quickly for even the most advanced medicine. Whitman, devastated, yet grateful his daughter had been treated with dignity instead of wasting away in Marietta's crowded public wards, accepted the explanation. He even handed Fletcher $10 more for burial expenses, never suspecting that Elizabeth had died not from the epidemic, but from Fletcher's ruthless cure. The next patient came on August 20th. Thomas Carmichael, a blacksmith from Belpre, arrived after his family scraped together their savings to pay for Fletcher's private care. 4 days later, he was dead, his body drained and poisoned in the same pattern that had claimed Elizabeth. By early September, word of Fletcher's hidden hospital had spread through southeastern Ohio. Families terrified by the mounting death toll in public hospitals, where treatment was little more than prayer and crude remedies, flocked to the Holloway farm, convinced they were buying the best chance at survival. Fletcher's background gave him the perfect cover. A physician with Philadelphia credentials, he looked the part of authority, spoke with confidence, and carried himself with an air of science and order that frontier folk rarely saw. The basement that once stored potatoes and preserves now held a steady procession of desperate men, women, and children who paid dearly to enter and never came out alive. For Fletcher, it was the ideal enterprise. A clientele willing to pay anything, a disease with a fatal reputation that disguised his failures, and a remote location where he could operate free of scrutiny. By October 1832, Fletcher had refined his grim business into a system. Patients entered through a separate door Marcus installed under the guise of quarantine. But in truth, it allowed Fletcher to control who saw what happened below ground. He tailored his fees to each family's wealth, $25 for merchants and professionals, $15 for craftsmen, $10 for farmers with little land, and often demanded extra for what he described as advanced European treatments. Families rarely questioned the charges. To them, Fletcher was the only barrier standing between life and a cholera grave. Yet inside the farmhouse, doubts began to take root. Sarah Holloway, listening to the moans of the dying beneath her children's bedroom, couldn't shake her unease. Every patient, Fletcher admitted, ended up in the graveyard behind their barn. "It don't seem right," she whispered to Marcus late one October night. All his learning, all them books and medicines, and still not a single one walks out alive. Even old Doc Hartwell saves a few now and then. Marcus, ever the practical farmer, dismissed her concerns. To him, rich or poor cholera claimed its victims without discrimination. Perhaps families only brought their loved ones too late, he reasoned, hoping wealth could buy them a miracle. But Sarah's instincts were sharper than her husband's logic. What she sensed, though she couldn't yet prove, was that Fletcher had moved far beyond desperate treatments. After each patient died, he did not stop. He opened their bodies, claiming it was to study cholera's progress. In truth, these post-mortem examinations were the next step in his secret obsession, turning tragedy into opportunity for experiments no one had sanctioned and that no grieving family would have ever consented to. Fletcher's so-called examinations were little more than crude dissections carried out under the guise of science. After each death, he harvested organs and tissue, preserved them in alcohol, and quietly sold them to medical schools in Cincinnati and Columbus. The black market trade in human specimens was an open secret in American medicine, where desperate schools paid handsomely for fresh cadavers, seldom asking questions about their origin. Fletcher's cholera patients, isolated from their families and buried quickly in shallow graves, were the perfect cover for this grisly commerce. His journal, written in cold, detached prose, revealed his true calculations. Patient Hendricks expired at 3:20 a.m. following depletion cycle. Immediate post-mortem yielded excellent specimens. Liver shows advanced cholera deterioration. Kidneys suitable for preservation. Heart muscle displays typical post-mortem changes. Total value of specimens estimated at $12. Net profit $37 after burial and preservation costs. By then, the basement no longer resembled a hospital, but a charnel house dressed in medical clothing. Fletcher had set up a heavy wooden table in one of the smaller chambers, surrounded by jars of preserved organs, rows of knives and instruments designed for cutting rather than healing. The limestone walls, cool and easy to scrub clean, became his storeroom, lined with glass containers that would later be shipped to classrooms where young doctors learned from the bodies of his victims. But in November 1832, Fletcher's carefully maintained facade began to crumble. Two events collided that would bring the truth to light. The first was the arrival of Martha Cunningham, the 16-year-old daughter of Reverend Isaiah Cunningham, pastor of Marietta's First Presbyterian Church. Martha had contracted cholera while caring for the sick in the church's charity ward. Desperate to save her, the Reverend borrowed heavily to pay for Fletcher's private care. Unlike most of Fletcher's patients, Martha came in the earliest stage of infection, still strong enough that she might survive with rest fluids and time exactly the kind of case that could expose the lie of his methods. The second event was the unexpected return of Dr. Benjamin Hartwell, Marietta's only other trained physician, who had been in Columbus attending a conference on cholera treatments. Reports of Fletcher's supposed successes had piqued his curiosity. Out of professional courtesy and genuine medical interest, Hartwell decided to visit the Holloway farm on November 12th. He arrived mid-morning expecting polite discussion, but instead found the basement door unlatched and silence below. Descending the stone steps, he stepped into a nightmare. Martha Cunningham lay unconscious on Fletcher's table, her body ghostly, pale lips bluish, the result not of cholera, but of massive blood loss. Two basins brimming with blood sat beside her, while Fletcher prepared a syringe filled with what Hartwell instantly recognized as a lethal dose of calomel. All around the room, jars containing human organs floated in alcohol like exhibits in some monstrous museum. Fletcher Hartwell's voice cracked as it echoed in the chamber. "What in God's name are you doing to this child?" Fletcher turned his apron soaked red, his expression twisted into something between defiance and madness. For a long moment, the two men faced each other across the limp body of Martha Cunningham. Then Fletcher, astonishingly calm, said, "Dr. Hartwell, I wasn't expecting you. Miss Cunningham is responding remarkably well to graduated depletion therapy." Fletcher stood over Martha Cunningham, preparing what he called her final dose of mercurial purification, when Hartwell pushed past him to check her pulse. Her skin was clammy, her eyes glassy, her heartbeat weak to the point of collapse. "This girl is dying of blood loss, not cholera," Hartwell barked. "How much blood have you taken from her?" Fletcher, calm as if reciting a recipe, consulted his journal. 42 ounces in the past 18 hours, with another 16 scheduled this morning. The humoral balance is nearly achieved. Hartwell stared at him in disbelief. 42 ounces. That's nearly 3 quarts. You've bled this child almost to death. Their argument carried through the farmhouse, echoing in the rafters, sharp enough that Sarah Holloway later swore she could hear every word from the kitchen. Fletcher clung to his theories, invoking European authorities and claiming his methods were at the very forefront of medical science. Hartwell, horrified, demanded he stop immediately and allow inspection of the other patients. That was when the truth hit. With chilling force, Martha was the only one left alive. Every other bed in the basement stood empty. Their occupants had been buried one after another in the field behind the farm. When Hartwell pressed him, Fletcher answered without hesitation, as if giving a lecture. "They succumbed before my treatments could take effect. The cholera is particularly virulent this season." But Hartwell knew better. Even in the worst outbreaks, survival rates were far higher than Fletcher's grim tally. His so-called hospital had become nothing but a slaughterhouse. Hartwell's discovery placed everyone in a perilous position. Professionally and morally, he had no choice but to expose Fletcher. Yet to do so risked dragging down the Holloways, whose basement had housed the operation, and more dangerously the prominent families who had entrusted their loved ones to Fletcher's care. In a town as small as Marietta, shame could ruin reputations and businesses for generations. The wealthy merchants, craftsmen, and landowners who had sought out Fletcher's services were the same men whose standing underpinned the community. To admit they had been duped by a fraud meant admitting they had effectively paid for murder. Hartwell stabilized Martha as best he could, giving her fluids, trying to restore the blood Fletcher had stolen. He sent urgent word to Reverend Cunningham, Judge William Putnam Merchant, Samuel Fearing, and banker Nathan Gilman, pillars of Marietta society. They arrived at the Holloway farmhouse that afternoon, summoned to confront the grim truth. Hartwell told them everything. Fletcher, once welcomed with open arms as a man of learning, was in fact a killer whose treatments had systematically drained life from their wives, children, and kin. Fletcher, cornered, tried to defend himself. He read from his journal, his voice steady, professorial, as if lecturing in a university hall. He insisted his methods were rooted in modern science, not malice, and that the deaths were due to the ferocity of the epidemic, not the treatment. "Gentlemen," he said, "what you see as extreme is simply advanced medicine. Every procedure I performed was designed to save life, not take it." But Judge Putnam, whose own nephew had been one of Fletcher's patients, cut him short. "Are you telling us bleeding a 16-year-old girl nearly to death is accepted practice?" Fletcher didn't flinch. In cases of severe humoral imbalance, yes, the corruption must be drawn out before healing can begin. Miss Cunningham's recovery will prove the effectiveness of my methods. But Martha never recovered. Despite Hartwell's desperate efforts, her strength failed. That evening, she died in front of all who had gathered: Reverend Cunningham, Judge Putnam, Fearing Gilman, and the Holloways. There could be no more denial, no more excuses. Fletcher's cure had killed her, as surely as it had killed the others. The room, heavy with the stink of blood and mercury, became a courtroom of sorts, and the verdict was clear. Fletcher was no healer. He was a murderer. Yet those same men standing in judgment faced their own torment. To drag him into the courts would mean dragging themselves too, admitting to the town that they had been duped, that their wealth and trust had fueled this chamber of horrors. The question that now hung in the farmhouse was not whether Fletcher was guilty. It was what they would do with him, knowing that a public trial would ruin them all. The men gathered in the Holloway farmhouse understood that Fletcher's exposure would ripple far beyond their own grief. Washington County's fragile reputation as a civilized, orderly community would be shattered. Property values would collapse, merchants would lose trade, and the town's leaders, judges, pastors, bankers, would be remembered not for their station, but for their gullibility in welcoming a killer. Judge Putnam, though torn by the loss of his nephew, voiced the fear plainly. If this becomes public, it will destroy not only our names, but Marietta itself. Who will trade with merchants fooled by a charlatan? Who will trust a judge who vouched for a murderer? Reverend Cunningham, hollow-eyed from his daughter's death, reluctantly agreed. His flock depended on the church for guidance, not scandal. The families deserved the truth, he admitted, but they also deserved to live with dignity. A trial would ruin the innocent as surely as the guilty. After hours of debate, the men settled on a compromise that satisfied no one. Confront Fletcher in private, demand his departure from Ohio, and bury the evidence unless he refused. But Fletcher would not bend. Cornered and furious, he declared he'd sooner stand trial than abandon his research. He threatened to expose the Holloway's complicity and accuse Marietta's leading families of profiting from his work. If he was forced to run, he promised he would drag them all down with him. The standoff stretched into the long hours of November 12th, with Fletcher barricading himself in the basement, while the town's most powerful men argued above about how to stop him. Just before dawn on November 13th, Fletcher made his move. He slipped toward the basement's exterior door, hoping to escape into the cold darkness. But Judge Putnam and Samuel Fearing were waiting. What happened next was never recorded in full, only whispered years later. At sunrise, Fletcher's body lay at the base of the stone steps, his skull crushed. Putnam swore the doctor had stumbled in his flight, striking his head on the limestone. Fearing supported the story. Yet when Hartwell examined the body, he saw signs of violence no fall could explain. Confronted with the choice between exposing vigilante justice or protecting the community from ruin, Hartwell signed the death as accidental trauma. Fletcher's death spared Marietta a scandal, but created a grim new problem: the basement itself. His journals, his tools, the jars of preserved organs, all stood as damning evidence. The solution was swift and final. Marcus Holloway, terrified for his family's future, bricked up the basement entrance, entombing Fletcher's horrors beneath the farmhouse. The official story was polished and rehearsed. Fletcher had perished in a tragic fall while tending patients, his hospital sealed to contain contagion. The dead were mourned as victims of cholera, nothing more. Reverend Cunningham delivered Fletcher's burial, attended only by the men who knew the truth. A modest headstone in Marietta's cemetery marked his grave: Dr. A. Fletcher, 1796 to 1832, taken by accident in service to his patients. The families who had entrusted loved ones to him accepted the narrative, grateful to believe their kin had died under the care of a trained physician rather than in chaos. Dr. Hartwell alone carried the full weight of the truth. He burned his notes, silenced his outrage, and turned to drink. The memories of Fletcher's basement, of Martha Cunningham's pale body, and the jars of organs gleaming in lamplight haunted him until his own death just 3 years later. With him went the last living testimony of what had really happened beneath the Holloway farmhouse, sealed away behind bricks buried under silence and left to rot in the shadows of Marietta's history. Marcus Holloway carried the weight of Fletcher's crimes with a farmer's grim practicality. Using limestone quarried from the same hills where his father had first built the house, he constructed a seamless wall that closed off the basement chamber, disguising it as part of the original foundation. He planted ivy over the exterior entrance until nature itself helped cloak the truth. Fletcher's tools and instruments were burned or buried in scattered unmarked graves across the property, leaving only the sealed chamber as a mute reminder of what had happened. Within a year, the horror had been bricked up, silenced, and folded into the everyday life of the farm. The Holloway family carried that silence forward. Marcus passed the secret to his son Thomas, who in turn passed it to his son Robert. Each generation was told the same thing: the basement must never be opened. What began as shame hardened into tradition until the wall itself became part of the house, indistinguishable from the foundation stones. Over time, the epidemic of 1832 slipped from living memory. The headstones in Marietta's cemetery told their silent tale. But the truth behind them was buried twice, once in the ground and once behind limestone. Meanwhile, Fletcher's reputation, protected by the careful cover-up, took on an ironic glow. As the decades passed, he was remembered not as a butcher, but as a frontier martyr, a man who had brought advanced medicine west and died tragically in service to his patients. Families who had once buried loved ones under his care told their descendants that Fletcher had done all he could during the terrible plague year. Marietta's medical society even established a modest scholarship in his name. Parents named their sons Amos, never knowing the man they honored had drained life from their kin. The Holloway farm prospered under its caretakers. Marcus lived into his 70s, Sarah a decade longer, neither speaking publicly about the months when their cellar had served as Fletcher's laboratory of death. By the turn of the century, the last witnesses were gone. The bricked-up basement became nothing more than an architectural curiosity, too expensive to excavate and too peculiar to explain. In 1930, the Great Depression forced the Holloway heirs to sell the land. The new owners, immigrants focused on survival, saw no reason to disturb old stones or old secrets. They sealed off much of the drafty farmhouse for heating efficiency, including the floor above the hidden chamber. Over the following decades, the farmhouse changed hands again and again as farmland gave way to suburbs and industry. Every new owner noticed the odd sealed basement, but each assumed it was for drainage or structural stability. No one thought to ask why it had been built, and no one looked closer. And so the wall stood its ivy, thickening its stones, weathering, until a young businessman from Columbus came along. He wasn't looking for history, only a quiet retreat, a fixer-upper with character at a price he could afford. But when he began renovations on the abandoned Holloway farmstead, he found himself face to face with that limestone wall, the one built by Marcus Holloway nearly a century earlier. Behind it, untouched since 1832, waited the truth about Dr. Amos Fletcher and the chamber of horrors Marietta had buried in silence. The renovation began like any other wiring pipes and inspections. But when the contractors reached the bricked-up section of the Holloway basement, they assumed at first it was nothing more than an old abandoned renovation. Building codes, however, demanded the space be checked before electrical lines could be installed. On a raw spring morning, the new owner and his crew set to work. The mortar that Marcus Holloway had laid almost a century earlier was as hard as stone itself, and it took power tools and hours of labor to chip away at the wall. The first clue that this was no ordinary sealed room came from the smell and earthy organic stench that rolled out from the cracks as the blocks came loose. When flashlights pierced the darkness beyond the beams, bounced off strange shapes, the outlines of furniture, metal tools, and rows of glass containers. Finally, the opening was wide enough to enter. With a flashlight in hand, the young businessman from Columbus became the first person since 1832 to set foot in Fletcher's chamber of horrors. What he found was like stepping into a frozen moment of terror. Fletcher's heavy wooden treatment table stood in the center of the room, its surface permanently stained dark with blood. Rusted surgical tools still lay scattered across smaller tables, their once polished edges dulled but unmistakable in purpose. Along one wall, shelves held rows of glass jars, long since dried, but still carrying the residue of preserving alcohol. Most shocking of all was a leather-bound journal, its brittle pages still legible, each line in Fletcher's meticulous script, documenting the so-called treatments that had been nothing more than systematic murder. Realizing the gravity of his discovery, the owner contacted local historians and archaeologists. Within days, the Holloway farm became the center of a full-scale investigation. The findings confirmed the worst suspicions of 19th century medical malpractice. Chemical analysis of the bottles left behind revealed mercury levels strong enough to kill a healthy adult outright. The dried blood on Fletcher's instruments bore genetic traces from multiple individuals, evidence that far more people had been brought into the basement than Fletcher recorded. Excavations in the soil behind the farmhouse uncovered at least a dozen shallow graves, confirming that the doctor's victim count extended well beyond his own carefully kept notes. The rediscovery of Fletcher's basement transformed the way historians understood early medicine in Ohio. What had once been remembered as the work of a heroic frontier physician was exposed as calculated cruelty, shielded for generations by silence and shame. The revelation raised not just questions about Fletcher himself, but about how an entire community, its leaders, its families, its churches, had conspired to bury the truth. What investigators uncovered after breaking into the Holloway basement was more than a local curiosity. It was a revelation that forced historians to rethink the very foundations of American medical history. Church ledgers, courthouse files, and family records from the 1830s, when re-examined against the evidence in Fletcher's journal, revealed clear patterns that had either gone unnoticed or been deliberately ignored. The picture that emerged was chilling, Dr. Amos Fletcher had murdered at least 24 people over just 4 months, all under the guise of advanced treatment, collecting sums that would have equaled a fortune on the frontier. The cover-up was as systematic as the killings themselves. Records had been altered and the courthouse death certificates softened or falsified. And clergymen had given glowing eulogies for a man they knew to be dangerous. Prominent families, terrified of public disgrace, played their part by remaining silent. What appeared at first to be a single doctor's depravity was in reality a community-wide conspiracy of silence. Medical historians who studied the case called it one of the most organized acts of medical murder in early American history. Even more unsettling research, prompted by the discovery, revealed similar suspicious death patterns in other Ohio towns during cholera outbreaks. Fletcher, it seemed, may not have been alone. On the frontier, where families were desperate and medical oversight was nearly non-existent, conditions were ripe for fraud, abuse, and exploitation. Fletcher's story exposed how easily respectable physicians could operate unchecked when their reputations and connections shielded them from scrutiny. For months, archaeologists and forensic experts combed the Holloway property, documenting every artifact. The basement chamber was preserved exactly as it had been found. Fletcher's treatment table still stained his corroded tools, still laid out his jars of residue, still lining the shelves. His leather-bound journal, now considered one of the most disturbing primary sources of its kind, was secured for historical study. Soil analysis confirmed the remains of at least a dozen victims buried behind the farmhouse. For their descendants who had long believed their relatives had simply died during the cholera epidemic, the revelations were devastating. What had been accepted as tragic misfortune was now revealed as murder. The Holloway family's descendants scattered across the country reacted with a mixture of horror and relief. Some were sickened that their ancestral land had concealed a chamber of atrocities. Others felt vindicated that the vague family stories about something bad in the basement had finally been proven true. For the broader medical community, Fletcher's rediscovery became a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked authority, isolated practice, and the willingness of communities to protect reputation at the expense of justice. Today, Fletcher's basement laboratory is preserved as it was found a place of study and remembrance. It stands not only as evidence of one man's crimes, but as a cautionary tale about how far communities will go to bury their darkest secrets. What began as a farmhouse renovation ended as the unsealing of one of America's most disturbing medical scandals, proof that history can be bricked up and forgotten, but never erased. The Holloway basement was preserved not for convenience, but for truth. Investigators recognized its importance as one of the most complete surviving records of systematic medical crime in American history. Its discovery ignited new examinations at other historical medical sites across Ohio and neighboring states. While no other location produced evidence as dramatic as Fletcher's preserved laboratory, researchers uncovered enough irregularities to force a broader reckoning with the way medicine had been practiced and abused on the early frontier. Genealogical research and forensic analysis confirmed the identities of several of Fletcher's victims, giving their descendants both closure and heartbreak. Families who had long believed their ancestors died heroically in the cholera epidemic were forced to confront the reality that they had been betrayed by the very physician they trusted to save them. In response, they established memorials that highlighted the values Fletcher's era lacked: transparency, accountability, and compassion. Even Fletcher's grave in Marietta Cemetery became a flashpoint of controversy. Some descendants petitioned to remove him from the section reserved for honored citizens, arguing that a murderer should not lie among those he deceived. Others contended that his modest stone should remain as a warning, a reminder carved in granite of how easily communities can be blinded by status and credentials. Historians noted that Fletcher was responsible for only a fraction of the lives claimed by the 1832 cholera epidemic, which swept thousands into early graves across Ohio. Yet his deliberate exploitation of trust, his calculated use of disease as cover, and his systematic murder of patients made his actions uniquely monstrous. Medical ethicists studying the case pointed to four enabling factors: the isolation of frontier practice, the desperation of families, the absence of meaningful regulation, and above all, a community's willingness to protect its reputation rather than confront uncomfortable truths. The limestone wall that hid Fletcher's crimes for 91 years has become more than a structural curiosity. It's a monument to denial. It shows how far people will go to preserve appearances, even when lives are at stake. But it also demonstrates something more powerful: the persistence of truth. Buried secrets eventually surface, and when they do, they demand reckoning. Fletcher's leather journal, with its meticulous records of bloodletting, mercury purges, and clinical detachment, serves as a chilling artifact of how professional respectability can be weaponized. His patients trusted him, not despite his polished credentials, but because of them, a betrayal that makes his crimes doubly damning. Today, the basement that once echoed with suffering is preserved as an educational site. Researchers and the public visit not to sensationalize, but to learn. Its existence is a stark lesson about oversight, about vigilance, and about how fragile trust can be when communities choose silence over truth. Perhaps the greatest lesson is this: concealment never truly protects. It only delays justice, deepens harm, and ensures that when truth finally emerges, it carries the weight of generations. The rediscovery of Fletcher's basement pulled investigators into a scene so grotesque that even seasoned historians admitted to being shaken. What they preserved was not simply a crime scene, but a cautionary monument, an unflinching reminder of what can happen when medical authority is left unchecked and when communities choose silence over accountability. Scholars studying the case are clear. Fletcher's actions were not the clumsy mistakes of a bygone era, but deliberate choices by a man who exploited his credentials to prey upon the desperate. Regulations and oversight have evolved since the 1830s, yet the dangers Fletcher embodied still exist. Wherever professional authority meets vulnerable patients, the same risks remain if vigilance falters. Just when we think history has revealed its darkest chapters, the horror sealed behind a farmhouse wall reminds us how easily trust can be betrayed. And if this story has sent a chill down your spine, share it with someone who loves uncovering hidden truths. Tap that like button to support our work and subscribe so you never miss the next dark mystery we bring to light. Together, we'll keep searching the forgotten corners of America's past, because who knows what secrets might still lie behind the walls of our oldest buildings. The Holloway basement also underscores a larger truth: hiding history never erases it. Communities that try to bury scandal only ensure that when the truth resurfaces, it lands with even greater force. From slavery to medical exploitation to industrial abuses, America's past is filled with moments when silence allowed harm to deepen. Fletcher's story shows us that concealment offers only temporary protection, while honest confrontation, though painful, prevents even greater shame. The tale of Dr. Amos Fletcher and his Chamber of Horrors is more than a story of one man's cruelty. It is a reminder that the most dangerous predators are not always hidden in the shadows. Sometimes they stand in plain sight, cloaked in credentials, respected by neighbors, trusted by communities. And that is what makes their betrayal most terrifying of all. Fletcher's cold-blooded killing of cholera patients under the mask of medical care stands as one of the most haunting reminders of how easily trust can be twisted into a weapon. The 91 years that his crimes lay sealed behind a limestone wall show us two truths at once: the power of denial to bury horrors, and the stubborn persistence of truth to claw its way back into the light. The families who paid Fletcher, believing they were buying life, were deceived not just by a fraudulent doctor, but by an entire system that put reputation above accountability. Their descendants, only learning the truth nearly 2 centuries later, reveal how silence ripples across time, wounding generations who had nothing to do with the original crimes. Fletcher's leather journal, page after page of meticulous records, proves that even the most methodical predator leaves behind evidence. But those pages also teach us something else. Records mean nothing if they sit unread. For 91 years, the proof of his crimes gathered dust in the dark. It wasn't Fletcher's skill that kept his secret safe. It was the community's unwillingness to confront it. This story forces us to face a chilling reality. The greatest dangers don't always come from lurking strangers, but from those clothed in respectability, trusted by their neighbors, granted authority by their communities.